Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Climate EDU. I am your host, Kayla Hathaway, and today I'm once again joined by Monica Sanders. For those who may not know her, Monica Sanders is a professor researching equity and addressing climate change and disaster response at the University of Delaware. She also teaches disaster law and hazard economics at Georgetown University Law Center, and all of her work is focused on equity and inclusion. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing the differences between environmental justice and climate justice. Both are critical topics that have a disparate impact on poor and marginalized communities globally, and understanding the context of these struggles can better inform activist action. Monica, thank you so much for joining me today. Welcome back to Simpatico.
Thank you so much, Kayla. I am excited to be here again, especially because we are in a moment after so much good political action to actually clarify what's the difference between environmental justice and climate justice, and why are they both important?
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. It seems like, every week there's just articles about good climate news, and I'm not even really sure how to process it.
I think we had a drought for a while, I think is climate change terms, and now we seem to be having, like you said, every week, like, oh, okay, we're doing some restoration here, we're in negotiation there, executive order, new appointee at the EPA. Like, yeah, this has all been just a wave of good news.
Yeah, I think they just got officially confirmed yesterday for the EPA head, right?
Yes, for Mr. Regan, I hope that's the way you pronounce it, from North Carolina, is going to be a new head of the EPA. And the Office of Environmental Justice restored, and that being environmental justice and climate justice being a focus of the administration, I think was officially announced the week before, if I have my timing right. So yeah, we are definitely in a much better place than we were a year ago this time, actually.
Yeah, and that is very reassuring. And to get right on into it, so you mentioned environmental justice and climate justice, and oftentimes the terms are used interchangeably, especially in like social media on Twitter. They go hand in hand. But it sounds like there's definitely a difference in the definitions, and I was hoping you can start elaborating on the difference between environmental and climate justice.
Absolutely. So, yeah, everything we read on Twitter has some truth to it, but is not exactly true. So, environmental justice has its origin story in the United States and is part of the civil rights movement. When it was taught to me, it's like environmentalism, as we came to know it in the 1960s and 70s, really focusing on the detrimental impacts of certain industries and practices on our environment, plus the social justice movement that was happening at the same time with respect to the civil rights movement. Later on, we would see social justice and women's issues brought to the forefront in that same time period, gets us to the place of asking questions about environmental justice. And there are two places in the United States that are important to the movement. One is Harris County, Texas, where we had, and for those who don't know, realize that's the Houston area. And to this day, 80% of garbage, landfills, waste facilities are still located in or near African American communities. The difference is from the 20s up until 1978, this was the norm. What really brought Harris County to the attention of the broader United States was a case called Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management. And the attorney handling the case was married to an environmental sociologist by the name of Dr. Robert Bullard. He's known as the father of the environmental justice movement. He has written prolifically. His writing, known as Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Quality, is still one of the seminal texts in environmental justice and environmental studies. So we think of Harris County, Texas, that case, which was so extreme, some of the jurors were accused of using the N-word during deliberations, as one of the seminal moments in what we came to know as environmental justice and disparate impacts. Around the same time, these two cases are happening within 4 years of each other. Warren County, South Carolina, is a predominantly African American community. It was chosen to be the site of a PCB dumping facility. This was not the scientifically most feasible. This was not the economically most feasible site. The only connection to why this was chosen was NIMBY, not in my backyard. This is a middle and working class African American area. It was chosen for the site as opposed to a wealthier demographic for the site. Warren County, and at some point when we do the recording, you'll probably get to see the protests. The people there began to protest. And when you look at the pictures, they are protesting this toxic waste dump. They are pointing out a number of the scientific problems with it. They didn't get the relief that they wanted. What actually happened was they still are the site of this dump and others that would come after it. It was just made smaller. And so you have Warren County, North Carolina, and Harris County, Texas, as the two geographic focal points of the environmental justice movement, where a lot of what we learned about disparate impacts and the combination of irrational economic choices and structural racism come together to impact vulnerable communities. When we talk about environmental justice, the two instances we're talking about impacted African Americans, but we also know that this happens in indigenous communities. We all remember Standing Rock, that's in our recent memory. And the correction of the pipeline issue is something that we learned about that happened in this administration, talking about good news. So when we talk about environmental justice, we are talking about hazards, waste, dump, direct environmental impacts in vulnerable communities. And this is nothing new, right? We still know that 56% of communities of color are near some sort of toxic waste site. They're 2 times more likely to live without potable water and appropriate modern sanitation. And we're hearing in the news now about the plight of people in Jackson, Mississippi, going into, is it week 3.5, week 4, without safe running water, safe drinking water?
I'm not sure. That story has been constantly developing, it sounds like. So it's like one of those things where I'm not fully caught up yet. But
Yeah, and I've checked in and out of it, to be honest, because I looked at it and I was appalled because I thought that we had learned from Flint, but apparently we have not. So that's environmental justice. Where people get, I don't want to use the term confused, but conflate the two, is when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about oftentimes the same communities, but then we're talking about their enhanced risk to the impacts of climate change, everything from urban heat islands to extreme cold, to flooding, to the long-term risk of sea level rise and all the other things that we're talking about. Why? Most of these communities are near coasts because coastal land is either cheaper or when it's developed, it's extremely expensive. So you have inequality happening there. Houses along the coast are either very cheap or very expensive. And the very expensive ones are often not the primary home, whereas the less expensive ones are the primary home and it's centered around livelihoods. So you have an increased risk of vulnerability to that type of climate impact. The other piece of it is that when you talk about specifically using the hypothetical of the African American community, 60% of African Americans live in the 10 states. And those 10 states tend to be both disaster and climate vulnerable. Yeah, those states are Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, the Carolinas. So when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about acknowledging those disparate impacts, acknowledging the heightened risks, acknowledging the lack of political or economic agency to appropriately mitigate or adapt to those risks. And then most of the time, because we're talking about some of the same populations in the same spaces, the added risk of what's happened because of the environmental justice misdeeds. So Houston, Texas has a huge environmental justice problem with all the dumping and the waste facilities. The oil and gas industry is also a coastal city that is prone to flooding, vulnerable to hurricanes, has the same population. So climate justice and environmental justice come together in certain places. So when people use them interchangeably, most of the time it's okay, but the biggest point to understand is that the remediation and the repair and the resolution in the courts and in policy still hasn't happened for some of these communities with respect to environmental justice. And so acknowledging that before we totally pivot to dealing with the very real issues of climate justice.
And so there's been some recent executive orders from the Biden administration addressing the climate crisis. And I was hoping if you can comment on the new climate change executive orders and what this really means for environmental justice and climate justice.
So look, the first thing about, one of the other times I came on the show, I talked about on my wish list of things that I thought the administration should do would be to revisit Executive Order 12898, which is the Environmental Justice Executive Order. What they did was they rolled that parts of it into the new climate justice executive order. So what that means for people is that exactly what I said, when we're talking about addressing the issues of climate change, we need to acknowledge the disparate impacts and also acknowledge this other problem with respect to pollution and lack of access to clean water and the ability to adapt in those things. So that is a major piece of it, and that's good news. And it gives activists from a wide range of places a more streamlined approach to advocate and for whom and in front of whom they need to advocate. The other piece of it was making this an administration-wide policy. So every agency, I think we were also talking about NEPA and how it's not that strong. The National Environmental Policy Act is still not as strong as I would like it to be, but by making it an administration-wide priority, what that's telling every single agency in the US government is that climate change needs to be part of your planning, needs to be part of your budgeting. When you do regulations and they go through notice and comment and the public has the right to respond to it, that climate change, and now because of the environmental justice piece, the climate justice piece of it needs to be part of it.
Got it. And so with what activists can do now with this new executive order, having more information about the ways that we can really start addressing climate justice and environmental justice. But I was wondering if you can give us some more like details on what we can do as individuals to advocate for environmental climate justice. Like we've seen marches. I think in our previous Just Chatting episode mentioned bullying politicians on Twitter.
Yes,
um,
do Twitter campaigns, get into their DMs. If their staffers are on Twitter, reach out to their staffers. You know, it's amazing to me how much is changing in between our visits or just week to week. So now what I found is there's a lot of online solicitation of ideas. I saw Cori Bush on Twitter, really asking for people's feedback about the Green New Deal and for, a piece of legislation that she was putting out with respect to environmental justice. And so there was a live Twitter exchange with a member of Congress, which I had not seen that before to that extent. And so shouts out to Miss Cori Bush for really engaging with the public and meeting people where they are, right? You're like, Twitter is a room where we're all talking about all kinds of things. So for her to get in there and solicit feedback, I think is great. Here's the other great thing is now we have offices to actually go to and petition, either in person or virtually. Look, the Department of Justice Office of Environmental and Civil Rights is open for business and being staffed up again. We talked
applaud this.
yeah, that's important. For people in the legal community, now you have those administrative options in terms of administrative proceedings and legal proceedings to file suits, right, to get a certain kind of response from people. So that brings that meaning back to it. And we talked about the new EPA appointee, who that was his work in North Carolina. So certainly is going to bring that into the EPA, but the Office of Environmental Justice is now a functioning office again. So you can go online and participate in rulemakings, put in petitions, offer your responses and ideas on things. The same thing is true in the Council on Environmental Quality. You have that. Also, civil society has re-engaged. In the last couple of weeks, I've seen, the NAACP Environmental Justice Program engaging and offering up dialogues. I've seen the League of Latin American Elected Officials engaging. So all the different groups are now engaging and having webinars and dialogues. So now activists can engage with civil society as well as direct engagement with government. Where the real work still needs to be done, though, is at the state and local level, right? Because in the name of the people in Mississippi who are suffering and still fighting for resolution in Flint, these things are also often highly localized, and exactly where you live can impact how you live, as it always does. So the next forefront is to make sure these federal values really make it down to our neighborhoods and our communities.
Yeah, and my question following up on that is like, who are some environmental justice and climate justice leaders that viewers can follow? And before your episode, I actually played the rerun of Mustafa Santiago Ali, and his episode he mentions I'm gonna butcher the verbatim quote, but how if you don't see people representing you, why aren't you running to fill those positions.
Yeah.
Um, just to kind of comment on, getting people involved. If they understand a local area, they can get involved in politics, even though it's absolutely terrifying. Um, but it's a
So
suggestion.
I'm going to follow up with my own quote from there's an organization called Vote Run Lead that I have been involved with and have been supported by and I support. And that's about putting women into political office at all levels. And one of their quotes from one of their programs is run as you are. So it doesn't matter if you're intimidated. It doesn't matter if you have millions of dollars in the bank. Like not every race is like what we saw in the Senate where they spent, I don't know how many millions of dollars in that Lindsey Graham thing.
Too
Which
many.
is what I'm gonna call it, that Lindsey Graham thing. It doesn't have to be that way. Because the reality is that county commissioners, mayors, city commissions on environmental quality. I even looked at an opening on one of the advisory boards on environmental quality in my city and thought about it, like, I wonder if I have time to do that. Those kinds of offices have the real direct impact on you as a citizen. And so if you look at it and, before the episode, we were talking about the body politic of disasters, viewing heteronormative maleness as neutrality.
Mhm.
If that is what is represented as neutrality in your neighborhood or in your city, perhaps it is time for you to step up and do something about it, or to support others who want to step up and do something about it. So yes, I agree with Mr. Ali and raise him one and say, run as you are.
Yeah, and do you have any other leaders that viewers of this episode could start checking out? Like, we definitely have Ali, but anyone else that you would recommend?
Dr. Bob Bullard is an active professor at Texas State, and he is on Twitter, so please follow Dr. Bullard. Colette Cochon Battle, who is an activist from Louisiana, my home state, but also one of the most vulnerable states. She does a lot of work around receiving communities and climate justice. So when people have to migrate and the community is not of the same makeup, she has a lot to say about that, as well as the affordability and what it means for poor communities. So Colette Cochon Battle. I would say globally, the South African Advisory Board on Youth and Disaster Risk Reduction are really taking this next level to the global conversation. I love seeing young people getting involved and speaking out and reaching across the Atlantic. Also, Dr. Richard Munang from Kenya is a leading researcher and voice globally about climate justice, and he really brings a whole of continent as well as an international perspective to this. So you have Mustafa, you have Dr. Bullard, you have Colette, you have the South African youth, you have Dr. Munang. Those are people that I follow and that I really enjoy. Follow the NAACP Environmental Justice Program and Jackie Patterson. Jackie is a legend in this confluence of civil rights and environmentalism. So if you haven't had her on Simpatico yet, and you can get onto her schedule, it is worth the effort of tracking Ms. Patterson down.
Definitely noted. And I would love to get more people on talking climate and environmental justice, especially now it seems like the ball is really starting to get rolling. With all the new departments being established with these executive orders. I'm like, all right, time to talk about it now.
Exactly. And there's plenty of people out there that have just been holding it all in and are ready to share what they've been thinking about and writing about for some years now. So there's a lot of great voices out there to hear from.
And we are starting to approach our time for this episode. But my final question for you is, do you have any other further reading recommendations for those who may want more information about environmental justice and climate justice?
Yeah, so Dr. Bullard's book, Dumping in Dixie, also Dr. Beverly Wright. Just look her up on Google Scholar. She's written prolifically about environmental justice issues, particularly in the South. Also take a look at some of Dr. Munyang's work. And then you have the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Facility, as well as the World Bank, putting out some really good practical works about climate justice. So read about both. Read more about environmental justice from some people who have been at the forefront of it, but also read about climate justice. Also, the Intertribal Environment Program, which is a coalition of indigenous tribes that think about the environment and climate change, have some great programming. But if you go to their website, they have some wonderful white papers from the perspective of indigenous communities that I don't think have been highlighted enough. So actually go and check out that website and read more about that perspective on both environmental and climate justice from an Indigenous point of view, which I think is an understudied and undernoted but important point of view to know about.
Oh, absolutely agreed. Now I'm good. Well, brain faster than mouth once again. So I'm definitely taking note mentally to pull that website up for the Simpatico daily streams and to like go through the white papers and like start talking about that because we absolutely need to be lifting Indigenous voices up way more than we have been, and especially now that we have climate justice and environmental justice being more on the forefront of policy discussion. So.
Right, and an Indigenous woman rightfully running the Department of the Interior. So there were ever a moment to, bring these people forward and support her in her work, right? Because we know that when we elevate women of any background, they also need the support from other women coming from the outside, knowing that they are there. So absolutely highlight Indigenous voices and make sure that her work and what she's trying to do on behalf of her people is also supported and highlighted. Yeah.
Well, thank you once again for joining me today, Monica. I'm going to go ahead and roll the end credits and we'll roll into our just chatting segment. So hang tight and
Absolutely.
we'll be right back.
Okay.
Like, all right, and we're live and chilling. But no, Ali, he is so kind. Like, during his episode, I forget what I asked, but he was just so sweet in his answers. And I went ahead and followed him on Twitter, and he followed me back right away. And he's like, thank you, sister. Blah blah. I'm like, oh, like, sister, like,
The
oh,
same way.
yeah.
He followed and liked something I posted. I was like, oh, he liked something I posted. That means I wasn't way like out in the stratosphere on some wild stuff. He's like, no, this
Yeah. It's like, oh, thank you for the acknowledgement.
right, because we struggle between like I'm confident in who I am, but from some people you want validation, right? It's like, oh, I don't live on external validation, but there are some people that when you get that external validation, you're like, oh, okay. It's kind of like a compass, like, oh, I'm heading in the right direction. But yeah, it's great.
Oh yeah, and it gives you like just nice cozy vibes. So, it's kind of like virtual like head pat. You're like, oh, thank you.
Yeah, and then you look at some of the things that he's done and some of the places that he's been. Um,
I mean,
it's awe-inspiring.
yeah, I mean, he was in the EPA for a long time.
Yeah.
Then, you know, with the past administration, I can see why he chose to. Yeah.
Yeah, there's just so much
Yeah.
happened. And I think we're all in this place of like, we need to talk about it to make sure that we don't end up there again, but I'm not really ready to talk about it just yet. Maybe over the summer we'll do some reflection
Hmm.
and think that how do we end up there and how do we not go back there again?
Yeah. I mean, that would make for like a good series, just like really kind of breaking down what happened, and especially for the perspective of just civil rights, and like that's a whole lens to analyze things through for sure.
Oh, yeah. And just the attack on civil rights and the utter disregard for the earth. I mean, this pandemic is terrible. And, I think a lot about it, the loss of life and the impacts, but in some ways it stopped some people in terms of manufacturing and development from, I think, doing even more damage than they would have had we not all been on lockdown.
Yeah.
Um, because, yeah, rolling back some of the pipeline regulations, in terms of load and how much pressure and that kind of thing. When you think about what goes through pipelines and which communities they go through, is just, hair raising.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't it in the past executive order from, is it January 28th? Or they stopped a permit for one of the pipelines, right?
Yeah, for Keystone, and so that upset our Canadian friends because it's those oil sands, but they'll get over
Yeah. It's
it.
like oil is so outdated. Like no more. We don't need it.
Yeah, and that needs to be part of the conversation about just transitions because, when you're talking about that pipeline, and also, the one that was going to is probably still, going to Standing Rock, but I think it's been halted.
Mhm.
Is that's you don't give people a set of good economic choices, right? It's work in this industry that is doing harm to your community or don't work at all, right? I don't,
Yeah.
yeah. And so we got to give people better economic choices. And so part of just transition isn't just about, swapping out energy sources or paying communities, right, for the swapping out of industry sources. It's a larger conversation about how do we give people a number of choices about livelihoods in these communities so that urban areas aren't the only place you can go and have more than one thing that you can do.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think you might I've been thinking because like more and more lately, like a lot of guests have been like on similar topics. I'm like, I just need to start putting together panels. Like, I think because Dr. Matt Henry, I had him
Mhm.
on like when I first started Climate EDU, and he joined me over on my other live streaming, and we chatted for about like an hour, just more casually about just transitions. But he's in Wyoming. He's in Wyoming,
Mhm.
and he's like, yeah, it's really difficult to talk about like just transitions and environmental humanities there because like the area he's in is very coal centered. Like the culture is you grew up, you would work in this industry, you'd be taken care of, but now these I think it was like mines and everything are being shut down,
Mhm.
and but then there's no replacement. Like they're just closing, and then people are here like, well, what do I do? And that's caused a lot of like grindy opinions about like the Green New Deal and everything.
Yeah, and you see that, on this side of the country, we talk about Appalachia, and, Joe Manchin is in the news quite a bit, but in terms of representing your people, he's representing the interests of his people. They don't have a lot of options, and we're not presenting them with a lot of options when we're having these policy things. Because I think you and I talked about, I was like, we need to acknowledge that injustices and just actions are focused on urban areas because we see most of it in the context of civil rights, which is not wrong, it's good, but we also need to acknowledge it needs to be centered around poverty as well and looking at other parts of the country where similar things happen, but we tend to overlook it because it's in homogenous, more European descended communities as
Yeah.
opposed to communities of color. But I was like, it's the similar issues is like people have only one thing that they can do, so it's do that or go on public assistance.
And then public assistance programs aren't that great depending and has like the limitations and the moment you get any kind of job it could be cut. Like there's I mean our whole like social safety net um could definitely be reformed. Could be better.
Well, we need to. One of the best things that I saw in that bill that just came out, you know, my eye rolling about the one check thing.
Yeah.
Was the conscious policy changes with respect to child poverty.
Mhm.
And then some people were like, these social safety nets. I was like, you mean making sure that children have nutrition and access to health care and access to free education at the most critical developmental stages of their lives? It's like, that's one of those core values of any society. Like,
Mhm.
who do we want to be? And are we raising the people that we want to be?
Yeah, no, that man, I that always kind of gets me heated. Like, you go on Twitter and people talk about like the stimulus checks. It's like, oh, well, free money, blah, like pull up by your bootstraps. It's like that's not. I don't. Do you not understand this situation that we're in? Like that's not
That's
possible.
like, in bootstraps, do you mean generational wealth? Is that what you want to be? Those of us who do not have such a notion in our families, you want us to pull ourselves up by the generational wealth that you've had. Those are your bootstraps, honey. That's not a real thing. That's what those bootstraps are. That's called generational wealth. And about 90% of the country does not have that. So let's move on.
Yeah. It's like, hey, actually, it might be a good idea if people could eat and not get sick and, be able to function in society without worrying that they might not ever have a roof over their heads. Just saying, that might be good.
Yeah, because I read things like that. And then I read a politician having a critical but valuable debate about, and it's, been a thorn in my paw for like probably going on 10 years now, and I should let it go. But the DOD won't let it go. Is that F-35 program that we spend trillions of dollars on and can't get a functional plane out of the whole business. And Congress is saying, why don't we stop? And the DOD is like, we can't stop. And I'm like, if we just stopped doing that, we could have like, how many of these stimulus bills could fit inside that F-35 program? Like if we took the stacks of money and put them together, like what's the differential in the stacks of money? I was like, we could pay people a subsistence payment every month and keep them from falling out of the economy into homelessness or poverty or other types of marginalization until we can safely reopen this country. Mm-hmm. Like we could do that. People look at, Europe is doing it, why isn't the United States doing it? I was like, we just have some very bizarre priorities, and we need to get past this place of every time somebody makes a suggestion to realign those priorities, we start using socialism out of context and academically inappropriately.
Or communism. I've been called a dirty commie. I think I've told you this before. There's so many times where it's like, oh, you dirty communist, here, you're so anti-American. If you hate America, just leave. And it's like, so are you going to pay for my ticket to go to Europe?
Yeah, I was like, I tried. I tried, but they were like, y'all have the worst COVID infection rates in the world. Don't come over here with that.
It's like, stay in your bubble. And it's like, wouldn't it be better? I think that's, and see, watching the clock here, so I'll keep this as my last point, but like, how the rest of the world is doing, I'm kind of generalizing, so I'll just say doing a lot better. Like, you look at the EU, and or I mean even like China on their climate policy, right? Like they've been, and the United States just for whatever reason can't see, or a lot of people can. So again, I'm using all the generalizing terms. If I were to put this in a tweet, I would get like flame tweeted at for generalizing. But like how the narrative, like I don't get where we don't see how like, oh, like, Finland basically eradicated homelessness by just giving people homes. And now their economy is great. Like, and that worked. And then the United States, or like the narrative, especially of like the GOP, is like, well, that can't happen here because, and it's like, but it's literally proven better. I don't, it's literally been done.
Right.
Like, it's so, I don't get it.
Like, we have case studies. We have case studies about universal basic income in the United States and how that works now. There's been improvement. I'm going to take you right back where we started with Mr. Ali. And it's sort of like, we need brave people to run for office and break this chain that we're stuck in, because we are stuck on some narratives. And when people accuse you of generalizing, it's like, well, no, we got big chunks of people who are stuck in the same place. They're in fifth gear and they don't want to level down. So now what we need to do is change the people who are directing this country. If it doesn't represent your values, it's time for them to go. And we're at a point now with respect to climate issues where we are out of time. Like no one has time for that. So we need brave people to run, and we need to be brave enough to go to the office and vote for them. And then if there's some shenanigans to try and suppress our vote, to stand up to those shenanigans and do it anyway. And that's where I'm at. That's just where we are. I was like, we need different people making the policy. And so in the name of Stacey Abrams and all that she does, our vote and access to democracy means even more now that we have to tackle this issue.
Absolutely. And on that point, thank you so much for joining me again, Monica. Thank
you.
And I think you scheduled one for April.
I did, and I am praying to the journal gods that this revision that I'm doing on a piece that I wrote about underrepresentation in data and how now we're making all of these programs to, help communities address environmental justice and climate change are run by AI that are biased. And how are we going to fix that?
Oh, okay, this is gonna be good. Yeah, so
But
this is
if
gonna
it's
be a good
not
one.
out, I'm going to say it's, in the publication process, and we'll talk about it anyway, because I think we need to discuss, like,
Yeah.
hey, this AI just doesn't count people who don't have a month-to-month cell phone plan. So,
Hey,
yeah.
that's kind of a Well, I'm so looking forward to that, and I mean, we'll keep conversing via email and like bounce ideas and everything. Because I know you mentioned doing more of like casual stuff, um, and doing some gaming with me, so that'll be fun. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and start introducing for the next episode. Feel free to sign out a StreamYard, and I'll send you an email with the official download episode once it's all updated. Within 24 to 48 hours. So.
Absolutely. Take your time. Enjoy your next interview, and we'll be in touch soon.
Oh,
Bye.
thanks. Bye. All right, everyone. So, up next, I have Smita Malpani joining me to discuss Washtenaw Community College's Associates of Science in Environmental Science. I'm going to end the stream right here, get my back end stuff set up for that. So, we'll have the starting soon screen back up in just a moment. And we'll be live for that episode in approximately 23 minutes. So, see you in